This is The Best, written by Say No More and read by Lalaspodfics. Summary. Cedric demands only the best of himself, and for himself. The best marks in school, the best position on the quidditch team, and the best reputation. When it's time for him to begin dating, he won't settle for less than the best partner as well. Chapter 1. Your parents must be so proud of you, his elderly neighbor Van Hesse Greybunt gushed at him. Who cares? Cedric wanted to respond. Instead of saying any such thing, he smiled at the ugly old woman, returned her smelly ugly crop to her, collected the reward she had promised on the notices she had sent out to her neighbors, and returned home. You make it look so effortless, Jack pouted, when Cedric caught the snitch for the third time in a row as they wasted time together during their summer holiday. Good, he thought, even as he put a conciliatory hand on the other boy's shoulder and promised to help him practice before Quidditch tryouts in the fall. You're such a good boy, his mother told him, kissing his forehead when he offered to help her clean the kitchen after dinner. The best, he silently agreed. Cedric wasn't surprised when upon entering Hogwarts he was sorted into Slytherin. Chapter 2. Why are you looking at me like that? Cedric's best friend Jack asked as they sat on the Hogwarts Express, traveling to school for their 6th year. My parents' friends have started asking why I don't have a girlfriend, Cedric answered. Jack's expression became dour. Is this one of those, I should do this because people expected things? Well, I should, Cedric replied. If I want a good partner, I can't sit around and wait for them to fall into my lap. I need to be proactive about finding a suitable spouse before all the good ones are taken. It doesn't work like that. Jack sighed. Cedric thought that these words might be Jack's catchphrase. You say that all the time, and yet it does work like that, Cedric argued. For you, in most things, Jack agreed. Dating isn't like Quidditch or Charms homework, though. For you, Cedric replied. The door opened and Cedric went on guard for a moment before he relaxed when their friend Elliot stepped into the compartment. Why are you looking at me like that? Elliot immediately asked. Cedric's decided he needs to start dating, Jack explained. Who, me? Elliot incredulously asked. No, Cedric immediately declared. You don't take your schoolwork seriously enough, and you do poorly at planning for your future. You wouldn't be suitable at all. Think Merlin? Elliot sighed as he slouched into the seat across from Cedric and Jack. Jack and Elliot shared a glance, then sighed. Elena McAllister had been making eyes at Cedric since they were 4th years. The Slytherin girl was pretty enough, popular enough, and she did well enough in her studies, but she had started hanging around with students who were a little too publicly interested in practicing the dark arts. With the current political state of the country, Cedric decided he didn't want to throw his lot in with practitioners of the dark arts before a war had even begun. Then, in the event a war broke out, the light won, and they persecuted practitioners of the dark arts to the same extent they had after the last war. Cedric's marriage to someone firmly entrenched on the side of the light would grant him some protections if his study of the dark arts ever came under suspicion. Therefore, whoever he decided to take up with would need to be inclined towards either light or neutral magic. Angelina Johnson would be all right, except that she was already hung up on one of the Weasley twins, and Cedric couldn't respect someone with such bad taste. A crush on one of the older Weasley boys, Cedric could understand, but Percy and the twins were preposterous. Cedric considered a number of other girls as well. It wasn't until Cho Chang smiled at him in the hall one day, and he forced himself to smile back, that he decided he should probably be searching for a companion among the school's male population. The gaggle of giggling girls which trailed after Cho in the wake of their brief interaction made Cedric's head ache. He doubted he had the patience to figure out the delicate ritual which dating women entailed. Even after making this particular decision, Cedric didn't have much success in his search. The males in Slytherin knew better than to think him sincere, the potential Hufflepuffs were too timid for his taste, and he found most of the Gryffindors obnoxious. Cedric managed a good snog with a Ravenclaw, but he found the younger student mouthy and overly opinionated. It wasn't until the Durmstrang and Beauxbaton students arrived at the school in order to compete in the Triwizard Tournament that Cedric thought he may have finally found a way to narrow down his options. Fleur Delacour managed to show her disdain towards others even when she wasn't speaking English. Cedric didn't like how haughtily she behaved, and especially didn't like that she was a Vila. He had noticed even a few of the professors giving her second glances during meals in the Great Hall, and Cedric wasn't fond of the idea of having to compete with others for his partner's affection. Victor Crumb was something else. He was tall, brooding, and the man was already well-respected, well-connected, famous, and rich enough that Cedric just might consider fudging his light or neutral wizards only rule. The older Bulgarian student seemed a bit too alpha male, though, and Cedric wouldn't abide being the non-dominant partner in a relationship. He recognized that he possessed an old-fashioned mindset, but when he thought of a life partner for himself, he pictured someone who deferred to his judgment in most things. From his relationships with his friends and family, Cedric knew he could only tolerate the opinions of others to a certain extent, regardless of the time and energy he spent making people believe he was good and kind and compassionate. With a sigh, Cedric resigned himself to looking for a suitable companion among the other visiting students. Momentarily dismissing the dilemma which he had tasked himself to complete this year, Cedric considered the tournament instead. He would win, of course. He would bring more honor to his house than Slytherin had received in a century, and he would make the Diggory name one of no, rather than a footnote. And most importantly, he would receive the prize money. After completing his 6th year, his father had promised that he would help Cedric find a summer internship with the ministry. With the prize money, however, Cedric would be able to take an apprentice internship overseas. There was a master in Germany he hadn't thought he'd be able to contact or pursue until after he graduated. "Do they want us back in the hall?" Delacour asked. Blinking, Cedric turned to watch as Harry Potter slowly walked into the chamber, his lips pursed and his eyes wide. He didn't have time to so much as open his mouth to reply before the chamber was filled with adults, all of them talking at once. It didn't take long for Cedric to figure out that if Potter had cheated, no one could prove it, and if he hadn't cheated... Potter stood to the side of the chamber, proclaiming his innocence only once, and sitting quietly and stoic as people called him a liar and a cheat. He was behaving with more dignity than most of the adults in the room. Cedric studied him speculatively. Before last summer, he had only ever met Potter on the Quidditch pitch. He had been flying against Potter for the past 2 years, after Cedric made the Slytherin team as seeker, and then outed Flint as team captain. Potter was a superb player, outflying Cedric even after Malfoy's father had supplied the team with the newest broom model. Most notably, however, was the beginning of their matches, when the players shook hands. Wood, the Weasleys, and even one of the Chasers gripped Cedric's and his teammates' hands so hard, Cedric suspected they were trying to break the Slytherin team's fingers before the game could begin. Potter, however, shook hands amiably enough, except for when faced with one of the Slytherin Chasers, Draco Malfoy. Potter had grown over the summer as well. When Cedric met him at the World Cup the previous summer, Cedric had taken note that Potter was still small for his age, but the lines of his jaw had hardened, and his big green eyes no longer made him seem young and innocent, but alluring instead. From what Cedric knew of the younger Gryffindor, he was a bit of a troublemaker, but well-liked by his peers, and even a few of the Slytherins, who were smart enough not to say as much when Draco Malfoy was in earshot. Potter did well enough in class, mostly considered mediocre, except for the few instances in which he excelled spectacularly. Then, even if his mother was Muggle-born, Potter's father was a respectable pureblood of wealth and power. The Gryffindor was still a bit gangly and awkward, and even though he had self-confidence, he seemed unsure of himself at times. He was young enough, however, that Cedric was sure he could properly dissuade any bad habits from taking root in the younger teen. The only issue was Harry Potter's status as a figurehead of the light. While Cedric didn't think it was best to throw his lot in with the dark arts practitioners, he wasn't thrilled at the prospect of throwing his lot in with someone already embroiled in conflict either. Glancing around the room, his eyes briefly settling on Delacour and then Crumb, Cedric wondered to himself, who isn't embroiled in conflict, one way or the other? Only the best, he reminded himself. Only the greatest. Decision made, Cedric caught up to Potter once the champions were dismissed. "Hey," he said, stopping Potter in the entrance hall by placing a hand on the Gryffindor's shoulder. He didn't remove his hand as Potter turned to look up at him, his expression weary. "All right?" Cedric asked. "Fine," Potter stated. Cedric's eyebrows rose. "Hey," he admonished gently, minutely tightening his grip on Potter's shoulder. "Come on, I know you didn't ask for this." His gaze abruptly transitioning from wary to outright suspicious, Potter asked, "You believe me?" "Of course. That lot back there only needed to take a good look at you to know you were telling the truth. It's not your fault most people ignore what's right in front of them, staring them in the face." Abruptly exhaling, Potter's shoulders slumped, and he seemed suddenly exhausted. "I thought I'd be able to keep out of it this year, what with the age restriction and everything. I should have known I'd be pulled into it anyways. It isn't fair. You're not angry, are you?" "Of course not," Cedric immediately answered, even though he had been angry for a bit. He'd soon determined that it was no matter, though. He would win regardless. "Why would I be angry?" "You should be the Hogwarts champion. You deserve it," Potter stated. Cedric blinked. He was used to people praising him. Girls gushed over how handsome he was, and boys were jealous of his looks. Teachers looked impressed as they assigned him points in class. The younger years thanked him for being so kind to them during their first days of school. People cheered over his flying ability when playing Quidditch. No one had ever complimented him so plainly before, however. "You deserve it," Potter said. Not like it was anything to be impressed about or envious of. He said it like it was a simple, irrefutable fact.
"Thanks," Cedric finally said. "But there's not much for it, though. The teacher said the contract was binding."
"I guess," Potter solemnly intoned, scuffing at the floor with the toe of his shoe.
"Chin up," Cedric demanded. "I'm sure you'll do just fine. From everything I've heard, you have a knack for getting yourself out of tough situations. And hey, we're technically on the same side. Either way it plays out, if one of us wins, it's a win for Hogwarts."
"That's true," Potter said, looking a bit more cheerful.
"Let me know if you have any problems," Cedric demanded. "I'm sure I can give you some pointers."
"Really?" Potter asked, looking skeptical.
"Of course. We Hogwarts champions need to stick together."
Potter watched him for a moment longer, clearly disbelieving, but then he said, "Thanks. I appreciate it."
"No problem," Cedric replied with a grin. "We'd better get back to our common rooms. I'm sure there are celebrations waiting for us."
All right," Potter said with a nod.
"Good night, Harry," Cedric said,
finally letting his hand drop from Potter's shoulder. "Night," Potter mumbled before turning and hurrying towards Gryffindor Tower.